Okay, why don't we go ahead and kick this off. Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to the National Transportation Safety Board's case study and panel discussion for the Truckee, California Challenger 605 accident. Thank you for joining us. I am Michael Graham, a board member with the National Transportation Safety Board, and I'm very pleased today to be moderating this important discussion. At the NTSB, we investigate all civil aviation accidents. We do not just investigate those accidents to determine what happened, but we also determine the how and the why the accident, how and why the accident occurred. Our goal with each investigation is to identify and highlight the safety issues of an accident, and for regulators, operators, crews, and maintenance folks to learn from what went wrong and apply these lessons learned to improve aviation safety and save lives. Every tragedy is an opportunity to learn and to improve. Tragedy struck in July 2021 when a Challenger 605 crashed while circling to land in Truckee, killing all 6 aboard. The board found that poor CRM and decision-making, as well as a lack of leadership, contributed to the probable cause. This accident has caught the attention of the business aviation community, and many questions have been raised about how operators address CRM and leadership within their own operation and through training. Today, I'll be joined by 3 Part 135 operators and 2 training organizations to begin answering those questions. Specifically, some of the questions we hope to answer during the panel include: what are some of the important elements of an effective CRM, such as shared mental model, leadership, and followership, and decision-making and good judgment? How does the industry train for CRM? And how do Part 91 and Part 135 operators safely crew aircraft with contract pilots? The operators and training organizations that join us today will undoubtedly provide us with some unique and important insights into these issues. This is a collaborative effort. We're hopefully today's discussion will allow us all to better assess where we are collectively on these issues. I also wanted to note that quickly that the NTSB does not endorse any products or services discussed. Some operators or trainers may provide information as an example of what works for them or services they provide. We recognize there are a variety of products and offerings available, and we encourage you to do your own homework for what works best for you. Here's how the program's going to go today. First, we have about a 20-minute overview presentation on the Challenger crash in Truckee, California, which claimed the 6 lives, from our NTSB investigator in charge, Stephen Stein. After that presentation, I will host a panel discussion with the 3 Part 135 operators and the 2 training organizations, and we'll discuss CRM, how it's trained, and the safe use of contract pilots. Finally, we'll open the panel discussion from the audience. This will be your opportunity to ask questions of our expert panelists. We will wrap everything up at around 6 p.m. And I want to really thank you for sticking with us with this late start. Thanks. Okay, without further ado, please welcome Stephen Stein. Stephen is a senior aviation accident investigator from the NTSB's Western Pacific Region Office. Stephen has been with the NTSB since 2012 and was the investigator in charge at the Truckee accident. Stephen will now walk us through the accident findings, probable cause, and safety issues. Stephen?
All right. All right, thank you, Member Graham. Appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephen Stein. I'm the investigator in charge of the Truckee accident, and I'm going to walk you through the accident circumstances and contributing factors that have led to this discussion. So first, a little bit of background. On July 26, 2021, Challenger 605 departed Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for Truckee, California. 6 people on board, 2 flight crew members, 4 passengers, and 2 dogs, as a Part 91 flight. No evidence that the flight was actually held out. A little background on the flight crew. The captain was not yet a full-time employee of the operators, but had his recurrent training paid for by the operator who fully expected to hire him as a captain, full-time employee. The FO was a contractor that the operator had found through an online website. They did an interview, Google search on the contract FO, but no PREA check since it was a 91. So for this discussion, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward us right to the approach and the letdown. So the crew had originally planned to fly the RNAV runway 11 for the runway length, but air traffic control gives them RNAV 20. Captain makes the call to circle to land for runway 11 after reviewing the approach, and ATC accepts it. But they never actually brief the new approach for runway 20. And they're also asked to hold, which goes okay only after the FO intervenes. Now, the captain is slow in determining where the entryway point is, ALVA, for those of you who are familiar with Truckee, and struggles to configure his FMS, so the FO makes that right turn to start the hold. As a side note, just generally, this would also have been a great opportunity. The hold would have been a great opportunity for that captain to make sure he was familiar with the approach. Brief the approach, the missed approach procedure, airspeeds, altitudes, et cetera, and to ensure there was a shared mental model between the flight crew members, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The FO also, during this time, offered, as they're getting to the end of the hold, he offered a 360-degree turn to the captain and gave good reasoning for it. When he asked the captain if they're going to be able to get down from 15,000 feet to 12,000 feet in 2 nautical miles. So this image shows the circling approach that they made presented in a sky view facing southwest to sort of represent how tight that turn was. Also, I've included the boundary line for the Category C circling approach to show how much margin they actually had to work with. The captain has trouble locating that runway, so the FO instructs him to make a 90-degree right turn to start the circling approach, and then tells him to roll out early. And for those of you who've read the report, we're not really sure why he did this, why the reason for the early rollout. There's no reported reason, there's no evidence, no obstructions, no meteorological obscurations to suggest this. Maybe there was haze they were trying to avoid, or maybe it was something simple like the FO had a good sense of the approach from previous experience. Either way, this put them on a course to the southwest when they should have been headed northwest, consistent with a normal downwind and base leg entry. So this graphic is going to show us the sequence of some of the landmark events that took place with some of the remarks that were captured by the CVR and that a lot of you have read in the transcript. So first, the FO identifies the airport as they're approaching the circling, or the start of the circling approach maneuver. And then he tells the captain to make that right-hand 90-degree turn. But 20 seconds later, he advises the captain to roll out. And now we start to see this transition take place, where the FO is starting to take a more dominant role in the flight. I'm going to get your speed under control for you. And accompanied by this statement, we see a reduction in power accompanied by also a reduction in airspeed. Captain identifies the runway with the help of the FO, and now we see a huge transition by the FO to a far more dominant crew member when he starts to issue this series of reassurances. Patience, patience, patience. You're looking very good, my friend. Nice and relaxed, bring that turn around. And of course, it's okay, you've got plenty of time. So before we go any further, I'd like to touch on the circling approach for a minute. Now, this is the manufacturer's Bombardier's FCOM Flight Crew Operations Manual. It is not the AFM, this is not formal, this is not mandatory. But it's their guidance for circling approaches. And it's typically used by flight crews. In this approach, you'll notice that it includes a typical downwind leg, a base leg, and it allows this sort of early turn towards final, giving the flight crew to really allowing them to just make small flight control inputs to maintain that stabilized approach criteria. Now instead, here we see the setup for the unstabilized approach. So in the blue line, we've got that circling approach path from the FCOM, laid over the circling approach that was made by the accident aircraft. Captain here rolls out early, like we talked about, under the direction of the FO, putting him in a very precarious position to make this pronounced late turn. So, and this is where we start to see improper decision-making take place and having a detrimental effect on the flight. So, the FO starts with, let me see the airplane for a second. And then we're going to go through it and come back, okay, suggesting his commitment to completing this flight, to actually landing the aircraft and not going around. And then the flight spoilers are deployed as they're crossing center line, and the captain is here. I found it, I see it, I see it. Yes, it's here, but we're very high. So here we've got a couple of things going on. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the red dots and green dots. So the red dots represent the stick pusher and shaker engagement. Now, they didn't fire simultaneously, but about that area. The green is where the stick pusher and shaker disengaged. So the captain first asking, what are you doing, in 2 seconds. Then we've got the FO coming back with, let me have the airplane, let me have the airplane, let me have the airplane. In 3 seconds. Now, during this time, they roll into a 36-degree left bank. Now, this normally wouldn't trip the stall protection system, but because they had the flight spoilers deployed, they lost an extraordinary amount of margin. They, without the flight spoilers deployed, they would have been able to go as far as 50 degrees. But with the deployment, 36 degrees before they stalled. Hence why the stall protection system triggered, and the shaker fires, pusher fires, and brings that nose back down, which is where it disengaged momentarily. At that same time, they roll to a bank angle, left bank angle, about 22 degrees. So they're coming out of it. But then they go right back into it again. And here's a video of the aircraft. I apologize, it's a little grainy. Of the final moments. And you can see that right wing come over. And that's it. So the accident was really the result of several causal and contributing factors, including those listed here. But we're going to be focusing on poor crew resource management, which is sort of the umbrella that contributed to all of these factors in general. So now we're going to move on to some of these key issues. We'll talk about them now. So we'll start, there's 2 items we're going to be, 2 main items we'll be talking about. So we'll be focused on CRM, how the accident might have been avoided, what tools, training, and procedures operators and training companies are employing to instill good CRM practices in their flight crews. And the subjects we'll be covering are shared mental model, leadership and followership, and decision making. We'll also be talking about communication as well, since it's part of each one of these concepts, really. We'll also be talking about contract hiring and flight crew pairing, which are both very relevant subjects to this accident, but more on that later. So first, what is CRM? For a definition, I'll refer to John Lauber's definition, former NTSB board member, using all available resources, information, equipment, and people to achieve safe and efficient flight operations. So through this, we're also really making use of the resourcefulness of the flight crew, right? So using basic concepts such as communication, coordination, teamwork. And I think we'd all agree, when properly practiced, CRM ensures everyone's on the same page. And information is openly shared so crew members can make better informed decisions. And there is a regulatory requirement, as you all know. It covers a minimum of areas, so including workload, situational awareness, ADM, but there's a lot more information out there, some of which is listed up here. Okay, so we'll start with shared mental model. So what is a shared mental model? The shared mental model is an aid for describing, explaining, and predicting events in a person's environment. And historically, it's been shown to improve communication, strategy, formation, and coordination. Ultimately, the tool itself can create a picture for the flight crew on how they should fly the approach. So one of the key ingredients, so how are we relating this to Truckee? So one of the key ingredients in building a shared mental model is communication. And in this case, there's little to no communication between these flight crew members outside of some normal cockpit callouts that were followed and some commands issued by the captain: descent checklist, please, ATIS, please. A good communication strategy here actually would have been included set expectation from the cockpit before they even took off, and an established tone, a leadership tone, which next subject I know, but none of this occurred. And a good example of the value of a shared mental model here was the absence of an approach brief for the new approach, for the RNAV 20. At a minimum, a walkthrough of this approach would have given both crew members sort of a unified impression of how they were going to fly the approach. But again, none of this took place. All right, so we'll move into leadership and followership now. So a leadership tone, and I'm going to spare you definitions. I assume everybody here is familiar with the concepts of leadership and followership. A leadership tone here was never established by the captain. Throughout the flight, the captain is asking the FO questions about the airplane. And I don't want to be too nitpicky here because I don't want to discourage flight crew members from asking each other questions at all. But in this case, since there's no established command authority, we can see how a more experienced FO starts to assume a role of a coach or an instructor pilot. And there were assertiveness and decisive action issues here too that we should definitely talk about. One of the most egregious of which displays was the captain's lack of assertiveness when the airplane was breaking through that extended centerline. He simply questions the FO, what the FO is doing, but remains silent when prompted to give up control of the airplane. All this taking place during a very critical phase of flight that required teamwork. But there's no team concept here. There's no teamwork. We had the captain, we had the FO, and each one of them had their own idea of how they wanted to fly the airplane and how the approach should go. But so no coordination whatsoever. And there's also any established guidelines between these two flight crew members. So followership, while command authority is built on credibility, non-command members, followers in this example, are responsible for actively contributing to that team effort. Monitoring changes, being assertive when necessary, but as we're going to find, there's ways to properly play this role. And I should also note that a leadership tone, in this case, encourages good followership when a captain clearly articulates their expectations and actually brings the other flight crew members into their decision making. In this case, the FO becomes a coach. And instead of calling for a go-around as the pilot not flying, pilot monitoring, once they exceeded the stabilized approach criteria, he's giving direction and attempting to save this approach. While that captain's lack of assertiveness during these critical moments may have motivated the FO, he still had a duty to maintain his followership role. A good example would be in this case, they could have asked the captain what he wanted to do instead of trying to force control of the aircraft. Oops. Okay, so that brings us to our third subject. And again, I'm touching on these, we could talk for hours about these subjects. But I'm just touching on the items that are relevant to the discussion in the panel. So next subject's going to be decision making. So how do we make decisions? So I don't really want to get too deep in the woods here on human factors because we could talk a lot ad nauseum about human factors here. But since we have little time, there's one area that I think really should be considered when we talk about Truckee, and that's time stress. Now there's low and high time stress. So low time stress is associated with a more knowledge-based form of decision-making. High time stress is associated with other forms of decision-making, such as skill-based. In a situation that involves knowledge-based decision-making, time stress is low. There's enough time to apply mental resources to decision-making, run mental simulations. In a more skill-based application, when time stress is high, there's only enough time to perceive cues and react. And a good example of that is critical phase of the approach, when you're in a circle to land situation, when you're setting up for final. To add yet another layer of complexity to the situation, the decisions are being made within a team structure. And examples of normal, effective team decision-making might include, in this case, taking feedback and self-correcting, adapting to changes, communicating and coordinating actions. In this case, we also had a flight crew that had recently underwent recurrency, yet they still could not or refused to recognize the severity of the situation. It also wouldn't be fair not to acknowledge the self-induced pressure here, since it likely drove a lot of this decision-making. Some of this being self-induced pressure associated with the high time stress condition. If we put those two together with the improper setup for the approach, combined with the first officer who's committed to salvaging an unstabilized approach, and the overall absence of leadership, it's really not hard to see how the tragedy of this event actually unfolded. Okay, so contract hiring is going to be the next subject. So now the CRM issues, these CRM issues are all associated with matched crew members. They can be associated with matched crew members, full-time pilots, contract hires, which we're going to talk about next. Now, we didn't cite contract hiring as a contributing factor in Truckee, but it still serves as a very important part of the discussion, as the case also revealed some of the challenges of contract hiring and flight crew pairing. So this flight crew, as we all know, had never flown together, and therefore never had a chance to practice together in the cockpit, let alone get familiar with each other's flying abilities or personalities. Both were also contract employees at the time, as I mentioned earlier. But the company had a financial interest in the captain, invested interest in his recurrency, having paid for it, and the captain at least had some in-dock training. The FO, on the other hand, was in a last-minute selection to fill a slot. He never had an opportunity to attend in-dock training, or even review the company's GOM, for that matter. So coming back to the takeaways here, so this is going to bring us to our panel. So we've covered some of the interactional challenges that impacted the flight, particularly how the absence of certain elements of CRM helped shape the accident. For the discussion, we're going to focus on how to improve CRM. By reviewing issues that fuel these failures with our panel of trainers and business jet operators. During the discussion, we'll also see how the contributing factors influence other operations and how those operators manage those challenges and to improve the overall general safety of their flight operations. Now, I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Member Graham. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Stephen. As you heard from his presentation, this accident was a result of numerous preventable safety challenges, and errors including an unstabilized approach, poor crew resource management, and a lack of leadership in the cockpit. Unfortunately, these issues are not uncommon in the aviation industry. During the panel, we want to discuss tangible solutions and actions operators can take to prevent similar accidents from happening. So I'd like to go ahead and ask our panelists to come on up and take a seat. All right, now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists to you. And to my immediate left is Richard Meikle. He's Executive Vice President, Operations and Safety for Flight Safety International. He joined Flight Safety International in March 2020 after 25 years at NetJets, where he spent most of his career leading the safety department. He is currently responsible for oversight of the safety program and learning center operations for the eastern half of the U.S. and all international locations. Next to Richard is Scott Snow, Head of Training Performance, CAE Incorporated. He joined them in 2013, and he also had previous positions included FAA Head of Standards, Standard Specialist, Falcon 7X Lead Instructor, Training Center Evaluator, and Simulator Instructor. His current position is Head of Training Performance Americas at CAE, responsible for the selection, training, and standardization of instructors in CAE's global training network. Next to Scott is the beginning of our operator panelists, and the first one is Stephen Myers, Executive Vice President, Elite Jets, and he's one of our small operators. Okay. Stephen Myers is Executive Vice President of Elite Jets. He's a certified aviation manager through the MBAA and is an FAA certified pilot who regularly flies Embraer Phenom 300s and the Legacy 500 jets. At Elite Jets, Stephen oversees day-to-day operations and wears many hats, including flight scheduling, aircraft maintenance, as well as training programs, safety initiatives, and compliance with FAA regulations. Next to Stephen is Jeff Baum. He's the founder and CEO of Wisconsin Aviation. Jeff is, I think you're still a member of the Board of Governors for the Air Charter Safety Foundation. I think you're a founding member and a former chairman of the board. And you also served on numerous state and local boards, including NATA and the General Aviation Task Force program. And Jeff represents kind of one of our medium operators. And then representing a large operator is Patrick McGuire on the far right. And he's been involved in both commercial and business aviation safety management leadership for many years. In this time, he has served as the lead investigator for any flight safety events at JetLinks Aviation. So thank you, gentlemen. And I just want to let you know how we're going to kind of start with an overall high-level 30,000-foot view of some of the subjects like circling approaches. And then we'll get into more of the stuff that Stephen was talking about with the crew issues and all of that. So as we get started here, I know I've been to several aviation conferences in the last year and a half. We've with a lot of discussion about this accident. There was a lot of information released already in the docket about a year ago. I've spoke about it and many others have. And I know there's some safety people out there that say their operations, in your operation, you should not be doing circling approaches. That's all there is to it. Okay, so I want to ask my three operators at the end, do you authorize circling approaches? And if you do you have any restrictions or limitations to them? So, Patrick, we want to start at the end with you.
Yeah, we do authorize them, especially at some of those airports where, like our special use airports, especially in the mountain regions. But definitely we have some restrictions, and there's some airports where we don't allow them either. And we review these with the pilots as well, and we kind of have a group that usually about once a year gets together. Sometimes we coordinate with other operators too, like NetJets or Wheels Up, to see what their requirements are, things they've learned about special use airports. But those are usually the only ones where we allow them, but we specifically do train on them, especially if we have safety events or reports that people submit. We might review that with the pilot group to get some lessons learned from those airports where we do utilize circling approaches.
Thank you. Jeff, how about you?
Yes, we allow circling approaches. We go into a lot of smaller airports where many times it's a one runway airport, and the approach is a downwind approach, and so you have to do a circle for a safe landing. We always look at each individual case on that, and one of the things that we try to do is stress in our own check rides circling approaches. And I'll pick on my two friends in the training industry here. Many of you are pilots out there, and you go to sim training and you do ILS after ILS, but they only maybe do one circling approach to meet the requirement of the training certification. So we try to really push the circling approaches and non-standard approaches in our own training.
Excellent. Stephen, how about you?
So we do the same as far as that we are allowed for circling approaches. However, we do have restrictions with them as well. If it's a nighttime circling approach, there's have to have VASI with them as well. Truckee is also a mountainous airport, which we do not allow. So we do practice, we do train, we do have check rides on the circling approaches and non-standard, but we also have restrictions on what that is, as well as our SOPs take into account the configurations and the requirements of the SOPs as well, which is different than Part 91. But yes, we allow circling approaches with restrictions based upon the risk associated with it.
Excellent, thank you. And well, let me ask our two training organization people. It's obviously a regulatory requirement to pass a check ride or recurrent that you have to do a circling approach, do you not? So what are your thoughts? Scott, why don't we start with you on the circling approaches?
So circling approaches are obviously a very challenging maneuver, and as Michael says, it is a requirement for type rating. It's a requirement for current training. And I don't want to say it's a problem, but we do have a limitation in the simulator training world with visual limitations of the simulator itself, and there are some regulatory limitations that don't allow the training provider to actually allow the students to train or experience circling approaches where they actually fly them. So it's really kind of motivated or mitigated towards the training requirement, the regulatory training requirement. And what we try to do is we try to enhance the training as much as we can to add a sense of realism to the simulator training.
Excellent. You have anything to add to that, Richard?
Yeah, I would echo that some of the regulatory requirements are quite challenging, in that until very recently there was a requirement there had to be a 90-degree course change from final approach to the landing runway. Just in the last couple of months, that has adjusted, and now there's a mandatory requirement for 90 degrees of heading change, but that can be 45 right, 45 left, which now opens up a whole lot more doors. So I think we're going to see some more flexibility in some of that. You're absolutely right. I mean, the visuals and the simulators, there's some challenges associated with that. But yeah, it is definitely one of the more challenging maneuvers. I think the other piece that is apparent is, when you look at some of the other accidents that have happened out there, and there's one under investigation right now where it's an over the top of the airport and then a turn, and that is next to impossible to simulate because of the visual limitations. But that is probably one of the most challenging maneuvers to do in the real world.
I believe you're talking about El Cajon, California one that we're waiting on.
Right.
Hopefully we'll see that report out here real soon. Okay, well let's jump into crew resource management. I'm assuming both flight safety and CAE do a lot of training for crew resource management. So
We do. It's baked into all the training.
it's baked in. So in your opinion, what is, let's start again with you, Richard, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What is CRM to you, and how do you teach it at Flight Safety?
Yeah, so without going into all the definitions again, I mean, everything that we talked about, or Stephen talked about earlier, it really encompasses it. But the challenge, and I think maybe just to jump straight to the point, where I think we see challenges in the training environment is there's the threat of the check at the end of the event. And people don't want to be that one that's drugged down by somebody who's not performing. And so what you often see, and I'm sure you see the same thing, is you have one candidate that's stronger than the other, and they will take a very dominant role at times, and then because they don't want to jeopardize their type rating. And so that creates an imbalance in the cockpit, and that's where the instructor really has to intervene and jump straight to that and deal with it. And a great strategy is pull them both aside individually, talk about what expectations are, what you're really looking for, bring them back together and say, look, I've talked to both of you now, let's make sure we got the same understanding of what needs to happen in the simulator going forward. And then build on that from there. But it can be really challenging. I mean, people are particularly on an initial, when you've got the type right out there, and that's the threat. Nobody wants to get to that check with
Understood.
Yeah.
been there myself. Any more to add to that, Scott?
No, Richard answered pretty eloquently.
Well, let me ask the three operators here. You're Part 135, so you have to have CRM training, correctly?
We do have CRM training. I'd like to add a little bit to what he had to say. So we're a small company. We have 5 jets with 20-plus pilots, which is small by comparison. And so we do not send our pilots in teams or as crews to training. We use both CAE and flight safety. And I think we use that to our advantage, frankly. You know, as he mentioned, that sometimes in the cockpit there's a tussle between who's in charge and who's not. And the way we view it is that we view that as an opportunity. So when you get in the cockpit with somebody else that you don't know for your training, that forces a form of leadership and teamwork that's required that would not necessarily creep up as if you went with your own crew member or your own team, you might have complacency. So by being placed into a cockpit with another pilot that you're not familiar with, put in a high stressful situation, I think we use that as a learning and a teaching element to improve CRM and mentoring when we do come back to our own company and flying with others. So we view that as a benefit and not a detriment.
Excellent. Jeff, you got anything to add?
I'll take a little different tact on that because we do a lot of single pilot operation. And we fly CJ Citation CJ series. We also fly the 500 or the 500 and 560 series. So sometimes it's a little bit different when you got guys that are really used to flying single pilot, and then you put a second pilot in with them. And many times they're both captains. So what we do there is we have to make sure that the ground rules are well established. Our guys, generally speaking, know each other quite well. But you have to say, okay, what are the roles? Who's going to be in charge? And so forth and so on. So you don't get both of them trying to do things at the same time. And that's really, it goes back to one of the things that was mentioned earlier, the communication. Communication is so important. I'm founder and CEO of our company. And so sometimes on certain trips, we'll have somebody in that doesn't know me that well. And the first thing I tell them is, there is no CEO in this cockpit. This is a crew. Anything you see, you say. If you see something going on, you must say it. You are a valued crew member. This is what your role is. This is what my role is. And you have to have that communication.
Excellent. How do you do it, Patrick?
The way it's actually been an interesting, not challenge for us, but a slight change in how we've been crewing and hiring pilots. Because historically, usually, we have a plane that has 3 to 4 tail-assigned pilots, and they get really used to each other, which is good for CRM, but obviously that can present sometimes issues if you get too comfy with each other. But over the past couple of years, we've hired more and more floater pilots that we can, they might go fly on this plane with this crew one day, but then they might be on a different trip over the next couple of weeks. So that has forced us to kind of confront sometimes CRM issues where this pilot is going to, new crews, and he's kind of the standard baseline compared to a crew that maybe gets comfy and gets used to each other's kind of own ways in which they have standardization in the cockpit, basically. So it's been actually useful in a way because we can work with that floater group of about 30 to 50 pilots or 30 to 40 pilots and ask them, what are the standardization issues you see in the cockpit, or CRM issues or lack of CRM. So we can actually kind of use that as a training tool to then kind of bake into our in-dock and recurrent training, and some of our safety lessons learned kind of focuses on CRM. So it's been kind of a focus area for sure, and we've learned a lot over even the past 2 years how we can best bolster CRM at JetLinks.
Okay.
I think that's a great point you bring up, because when you have somebody flying that isn't used to flying with somebody else and doing a little debrief with them and say, hey, what did you see here that you don't see with the other guys?
Exactly.
It works.
So how do you evaluate your effectiveness of your CRM program? Is there any tools you use to collect that, and how do you make improvements to that? I mean, if you're doing an SMS program, safety assurance is part of that. So how do you do that with CRM?
Well, one of the things is what we just talked about, where you debrief when somebody's been flying with somebody else. But also, as a check airman, I really watch for it on check rides. How's that crew member working? And there's a lot of times we can train and we can preach, but are they doing it? So you really want to find out, watch for those little details. Are they really doing what, walking the walk, not just walking the talk?
Okay.
And I know at JetLinks, outside of normal, ASAP reports, safety events that we look into, a new thing we've been exploring and testing is kind of our own approach to LOSA. So we didn't really have a LOSA program or kind of safety observation at JetLinks, mostly because most planes don't have jump seats, or if they do, it's nothing like a 767 or anything. So we've actually started to test and do LOSAs utilizing GoPros. So on empty legs, if there's no clients or anything, and voluntarily, if the crew agrees to do it, we'll place a GoPro behind them that connects into their headsets so we can kind of hear their communication. And by completing about 5 observations a month and hopefully doing more of them, that's been a useful tool to kind of pick up on CRM or lack of CRM. Usually that's one of the first questions we kind of code is this a crew that flies with each other a lot or no? And that kind of helps us dive into any kind of CRM takeaways.
I would say since we have only 2 different types of aircraft that we fly, both Embraer, our pilots are typed on both of them. And so we don't have crews that stay together. We have the ability to swap them out all the time. And so we're captain heavy, but we also have IOE pilots and we have mentoring pilots as well. And so not only do we have the SMS, not only do we have the changing of the crew, but we also talk about it. We have weekly meetings in our management meetings. We talk about the pilots and if there's a challenge or with one of the pilots or somebody else, we crew them with somebody else and go through the whole thing. And we tell the pilots, we're saying, hey, we think there may be a weakness or a challenge here. And we're very transparent with it in order to improve the communications. And some of our pilots, or English is not their first language, so oftentimes it's a language issue, which gets back to your point as far as the communication within the cockpit, with the customers, and then also with ATC as well. And so we have many different avenues of testing and verifying and reporting CRM.
Okay. Any thoughts from?
I actually have one comment, and it kind of goes to what the operators are saying. From a training perspective, we get to see the fruits of their labors in terms of how well their SOPs are written and how well their CRM training takes place, because we actually get to see it, especially when a crew pair comes from the same company. You can tell when the SOPs are well written and that the crew duties are defined very, very effectively. You see that in positive performance. Conversely, when you have SOPs, crews that come from companies where the SOPs maybe are not so well written, you see a degradation in performance. So it really, really is a correlation. And we actually get to see what they're talking about.
Do you see conflicts when you have 2 different operators paired together?
We do sometimes. We do.
I'm sure you do.
Yep.
I think there's a different dynamic too when you have 2 PIC qualified individuals in training at the same time. So if they're paired together up front, that creates a slightly different dynamic than when you have a pure captain, pure SIC in the cockpit. Because if you've got the 2 captain qualified individuals, and that's a whole nother topic that we could get into, is this whole captain, co-captain thing, which seems to have crept into the industry, and there is no such thing. But when you have 2 captain qualified individuals up front, they understand what each other's role clearly is. When you have a first officer and a captain, while they understand their role, there's a different approach to it. And so it does create a slightly different dynamic. I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other, but it does create a different dynamic that you have to be cognizant of. So.
Okay. Great. Let's switch gears here a little bit. Stephen talked about shared mental model, and the model aids people in describing, explaining, and predicting events in their environment. This flight crew that Stephen talked about in the accident obviously didn't share any mental model or brief for the approach. I know that term may be a little bit new to this industry, but how does your operation, maybe the operator, how do you share the mental model between crews? And have you seen any challenges there, or good or bad examples of a shared mental model? Anybody want to jump on that one first?
I'll start as the little guy, which is basically follow the SOPs. I mean, which is what he mentioned. And again, Part 91 versus Part 135. The accident was Part 91, but Part 135, we have the SOPs. We train to the SOPs. And even if you don't know who's in the other, in the seat next to you, or it's the first time you've flown with them, then you know what the expectation is if everybody follows the SOPs. So from that standpoint, and the other part of it is teach. You talk about the PIC and the FO or whatnot, but teach by example. Don't necessarily dictate to what they should be doing. So it's what is your leadership style? What is your communication style? What works, what doesn't? And also mentioned during the presentation is the communication and the teaching aspect of it should be in a low pilot workload standpoint. They should have briefed the approach when they were in cruise before they even started descending. I mean, we're not going to dissect the whole thing, but the point is if you follow your standard operating procedures, you should be able to fly with anybody safely. They don't have to be your best friend, but you should be able to safely fly the aircraft following the procedures that you were taught and trained and reviewed on.
Good point.
You know, we don't know all what went on prior to the accident with these two crew members. And in a way, I really feel sorry for them because the company put them in such a bad position by having the new captain there who was a Mexican national, did not even have a visa to function in a commercial, to be paid for his performance. And then they bring in the other guy. So as best I could tell in going through the accident, they really had no chance to get to know each other or to brief or to do anything else. So in answering your question, Michael, what we try to do is anytime you have crew members that have not been paired together, we want them to spend some time together to look at what the mission is, what the flight's going to be, what the risks they're going to be taking, and go through weather, go through the airports, go through all that stuff before they ever get in the aircraft. So they all have a very good idea, the shared mental model of what they are supposed to be doing and most of the things that they will encounter during that time. And if they know each other, I watch the crews, and they're sitting there doing the jabber jabber before they ever get in the airplane, which is great.
Good point.
Like he said, a lot of, especially when we have crews that are not used to flying with each other, we incorporate it into like our flight risk assessment tool, FRAT score, as well as we also promote extra time briefing, especially debriefing too, after a flight to kind of, take some lessons learned. But a lot of it, we just promote, to the broader question, we just promote professionalism in the cockpit, making sure we're adhering to SOPs. But we also try to empower our captains. We have about, I think, 30 pilots we've kind of given the title of senior captains because we appreciate their leadership and their approach to being a great, captain on the flight deck. So especially them with their, we have about 20 bases. Through their weekly or monthly huddles, we promote them, debriefing event a little bit more, or sharing some lessons learned, or, basically kind of just continuously taking that approach to training and improving. So we really do promote transparency and just, empowering all of our pilots, but especially the ones we trust a lot as leaders to do that.
Excellent. Any thoughts from our training operators?
I'd actually like to talk about threats for a minute because,
Okay.
And everybody understands what a threat is, right? It's that situation or that thing out there that we don't have any control over. The Truckee accident's a classic example of some of the threats that were present that the crew didn't identify. And to have a shared mental model, both crew members have to understand what those threats are. And so threat assessment in any operation, specifically in circling approaches, is critical to success. You have to actually identify the threats. You have to both understand what the threats are. We like that concept that Alaska Airlines uses that says, okay, this is what I see today for this departure or this approach. What do you see? And they talk about it as a crew and they come up with a shared mental model. So threat assessment is critical. And then of course that leads to threat mitigation opportunities, which also didn't occur because they didn't assess the threats at Truckee.
Good point. Yeah, and unfortunately, you look at the CVR, the brief that they had for the 1-1 approach wasn't very good to begin with either in my book. especially for one of the pilots, or the FO, had no SOPs, no GCOM or any of that stuff, and the other one had it, but we don't know if he actually reviewed it or anything, but it wasn't shared, so.
Right.
It's very, Richard?
Yeah, certainly you can see in this accident that that mental model didn't exist and that they hadn't really created space for themselves. And that's something that in training you can see as well, where somebody starts to compress or overload the situation. And I know there's a lot of stuff that has to happen in those simulator sessions, but it's very easy to overload somebody pretty quickly. And that's what happened in this accident. The fact that they were even talking about runway 20 to start with should have been discussed way back, because they knew it was too short well before they ever got to that approach brief. So that should never have even been in the question. In reality, for that runway, that airport, they really only had one viable runway, and that was 11. And there's an approach to run 11, if I remember correctly, and they could have easily just said, no, we would request the runway 11 RNAV or whatever the procedure is. Had that discussion way back, then they understand how they're going to get there, and so they've created a plan. They've set progress markers as to how are they proceeding to that plan. They've created time because they've done all of this stuff way back early. And it really all sort of parlays into that whole slow is smooth, smooth is fast. If you've done all of those things by creating the space and got your plan and you've got your progress, you know when you're going off course, and it's pretty easy to say, let's leave. Let's just recover to a safe altitude and do it again.
Yeah. Yeah, the 1-1 approach, they had briefed it, had just briefed it, and then they were given 2-0, and they didn't bother to ask for 1-1.
Yeah.
We're never going to know why. Yeah. And the sad thing was, I think in the interviews, if I remember right, they'd asked the controller if they would have asked for it, would you give it to him? He said, oh yeah, no problem. So doesn't make any sense. Let's talk about leadership and followership that Stephen talked about here. And Scott, maybe we'll start with you. We know there was definitely an absence of leadership tone from the captain, who was the pilot flying. He lacked assertiveness and everything, and he kind of withdrew near the end of that flight. And everything happened really quick on that little tight maneuver circle to land there. And I know you've seen a lot of different pilots come through, so I'm sure you know how to answer this, but how do you teach leadership for a pilot, maybe an initial or a recurrent that's struggling with leadership? And in this case, how would you teach this pilot, the captain, how to get some of that leadership back in the cockpit if you start losing it?
Well, part of it is the training itself, right? What training does is it shows a pilot that he or she is capable of actually performing when leadership's required, and so that's a key part of it. And again, it goes back to in the training world, we're always focused on the maneuver, completing the maneuver to make sure the check ride's done. But we have to really focus on the CRM aspects, right? And then the non-technical skills, of which leadership is an important piece. And so what we try to do is we try to show any pilots who are struggling with their own assertiveness, their own ability to lead, how they can do that more effectively, how they can do that better. At the Truckee accident, one of the things that stuck out to me was the leadership failure started right when ATC said runway 20, and an assertive captain would have said, "Hey, hold it a second, I want runway 11, runway 11," right? So that's a leadership failure right there, and perhaps it was the situation that poor captain was in, right? Brand new guy, part-time, trying to get a full-time job. That's a challenge, but to me that was the thing that stuck out first about his lack of leadership, his lack of assertiveness.
Richard, do you have any thought on leadership, how flight safety does it?
Yeah, a very similar way, obviously, but I mentioned earlier sort of a strategy when it starts to get way out of control. But certainly going through where an event went badly in the simulator and backing into it using all of those soft skills as the debrief tool, as opposed to you were 4 knots fast, or you were 150 feet low or high. That stuff's irrelevant. If you've hit the obstacle, whether you're 150 feet low doesn't matter. You've hit the obstacle. So having that soft skills discussion first and saying, look, let's back up and find where was this that it broke down, and what could we have done differently? But then, depending on how severe it is, there may need to even get to the point where you have to have a crew change. You could have, depending on that whole matrix of assertive versus laissez-faire and passive versus aggressive. If you got somebody who's super assertive and pretty dominant, you may just need to just do the swap out and get to that point. But we obviously try and avoid that, because that may still happen in the real airplane, and they've got to be prepared to deal with it.
Good point. Let's shift over to our operators again here. Let's talk about leadership training. I know it's not required in Part 135. I know we recommended to the FAA after the Colgan Air that it be 121, 135. We only got the 121 out of them. So do you all do leadership training? Yeah.
I know for us, we bake it into our recurrent in training, especially for a lot of our senior captains, like I mentioned, in PICs. From a safety standpoint, we really do try to promote it through kind of different collaboration groups we have. We have like a quarterly pilot safety call where it's just the safety team and all pilots that are invited. There's no, chief pilots on there or flight ops leadership things or management, things like that. And usually out of our 300 pilots over the course of 3 days, we usually get about 200 people that join various calls. And even just kind of yearly similar to this, we had a crew that had never flown into Truckee before around August, and they were given a different approach on their descent, and they had to go around and they filed an ASAP and with some concerns about kind of their preparation for going into Truckee. And when we published that report in a de-identified way, we published it for all pilots to learn from those events. We got a lot of calls from people that fly into Truckee all the time, and they're like, oh, well, I'd be happy to help, or even just talk to this pilot to kind of brief them more in the future. So when we kind of basically merged those two kind of parties together, now we've kind of developed at least a pool of experienced pilots who have flown into certain mountainous or special use airports that, hey, if there's a new pilot or maybe a new hire that's flying into somewhere like Truckee or Aspen or Eagle for the first time, they can reach out to this kind of more experienced pilot for this airport to just brief a little bit better. So that's been a way we've just tried to promote kind of leadership, and maybe we're fortunate that we have a lot of pilots who are happy to get involved. That's been a really kind of interesting way we've done it as of late.
Great.
Communicating expectations. You are the captain. You are responsible for the safe flight of this airplane, and you're responsible for bringing it back in the same condition that it left. So you will make the decisions, and you are the leader for that flight.
I would say for us, even though we're a small operator, we're fortunate that we have a large ratio. We have a large number of pilots for the number of planes that we have. And so from that standpoint, just because you get a type rating as a PIC doesn't make you a captain at our company. So after you become a PIC and you have your type rating, then we have an IOE that you go through in order to become a captain. And so that's roughly about 35 to 50 hours of flight time that you have to go through that IOE, and you have to fly with mentor pilots as well. And then before you can be promoted to a captain, you have to have unanimous approval from the senior captains and management. And we're a little bit different. Everybody in our management flies except for the president. So, and he was a pilot also. He's just not current. So, so we make sure we take the time and we see people in action as far as performing the SOPs when they're supposed to. And then also dealing with the stress of the whole flight, whether it's the planning, the weather, the changes, the dog, the rain, the whatever it is, before they become captain. So we make sure that we as a company are comfortable before we name somebody captain. Just because they have a type rating or they're PIC or they pass the check right in the sim after 4 or 5 days, which is great, but we try to make sure that our pilots that are captains are well-rounded in everything.
Well, let me ask you this too, the operators. What I saw in that cockpit is what I like to call a reverse leadership gradient. we had a captain who had a little over 5,000 hours. I think he had just over 250 hours in the Challenger, if I remember right. And you had the first officer, the contract pilot, who had well over 14,000 hours, and I think he had 10 times the hours, 2,000 and some, in the Challenger. Have you run into any issues like that in your operations? And if you did, how did you handle that, where maybe the right seater or the FO was being a little overbearing? You ever run into that?
Yeah, we've certainly run into it, especially sometimes with pilots we maybe have recently hired who have just come from the major airlines, and they're very experienced pilots, but they're newer in the type, at least from a business aircraft standpoint, but they're confident in their flying skills, and sometimes there is issues with CRM, or at least on the onset. So a lot of that we do promote, trying to tackle it through debriefing and through kind of the ongoing leadership at each base, working with your chief pilot on any issues or concerns. But we really, especially as of late, have been hampering on the power of the debrief. If you think there's an issue or you have a concern, whether it's PIC and the SIC or whoever, don't just file a report to safety. At least try to debrief it and talk through it, and then we can kind of go from there. But there's definitely countless examples where we run into issues, CRM issues, and then we ask first, did you debrief? And a lot of times they didn't. So that's at least the first step we always promote is talking to each other, kind of as it goes back to professionalism.
Okay.
We have a fairly small cadre of pilots, and we really don't have that problem. A couple of problems that we have seen are a couple guys that want to prove how smart they are. And, hey, instead of doing it this way, how about this? And so we try to make sure they don't deviate from the standards that we have set up and come up with their own way of doing things. And that's more of the problem that we've seen.
Okay.
I would say we subscribe to the FAA's recommendation, time and type and recency. So it doesn't matter if we have a 15,000-hour retired captain that was flying 757s. It doesn't matter. It's totally different. It's totally different. So they may have airmanship, but the whole aspect in order to be a captain for us is you have to understand everything all the way around. It's not your past experience is great, but you have to demonstrate it for our organization and our SOPs.
Okay. Let me shift back to our training operators, because I know you see a lot of different operators come through and a lot of different types of pilots and everything. And let's face it, this captain was way behind the aircraft, is what I like to say. But, there were some decisions made from the right seat pilot that didn't make a lot of sense, and, unfortunately, helped them meet their demise, unfortunately, there. And decision-making and judgment, or bad judgment and bad decision-making, is one of those human factors, performance issues that it's always going to be out there. How do you work with somebody in a simulator environment to get by some of those bad decisions? Because I know you see them in there, and I'm sure we've all been in there and made some of those bad decisions in the box. But how do you teach a pilot to overcome that or be assertive to that person trying to drive the flight in the right seat, and then unfortunately in this case drive it into the ground?
So what we do is we use root cause analysis and facilitation in the debriefing. So when we see a situation like that, Michael, what generally the instructor will do is in the debriefing, he'll actually get the two pilots to talk to one another and get the first officer to say, how did you feel about that maneuver or procedure? What was the captain doing that interfered with your ability to accomplish the mission, and vice versa, and actually get them to talk. As opposed to being lectured by the instructor, they talk it out. And they say, well, yeah, if you'd done it this way, that would have been a little better for me. And basically let them solve their own problems or solve their own issues. But that facilitative process where the two crew members talk to one another in a debrief about how to make it go better the next time has proven invaluable in training.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly agree with all of that. I think there's also the impact of you chose the adventure, let's see how it plays out type thing in the simulator that has some natural teaching moments, shall we say. I think the other piece that we're focused on the fact that we had a very dominant FO in this particular accident, but having a very passive FO can be equally dangerous. And so I think the strategy you were just talking about there is, look, you let this individual goad you into this particular activity. Why? Or maybe it's not even they were particularly dominant in the left seat, but the first officer they let it proceed. I mean, there's numerous accidents in history where somebody in the cockpit knew the right answer, they just didn't speak up. And so I think it is really important for it to be a balance and for them to understand that being overly passive. I remember the most stupid thing I've done in my career. I was a young captain at a commuter, and I was a pretty dominant captain, and I regret it now, but back then, and I was flying with a very passive FO, and we got ourselves into a pickle with fuel. I mean, it ended up working out fine, but it was pretty touchy there for a few minutes.
That's where CRM came from,
Yeah,
didn't we?
right.
From a few of those accidents where somebody had a piece of the puzzle, but was either shut down and decided, okay, I'm going to back out of this and be passive. Okay.
Yeah. I have one other observation about
Sure.
leadership before we move on. And I think it's important, and it might be understated a little bit, but a person's ability to lead is intrinsically linked to their knowledge base. And so what we see in training time and time again is a captain or student captain who's playing that role, who's not prepared, doesn't have the knowledge base, doesn't have the level of knowledge that he or she needs, can't make good decisions, leadership decisions, right? That adversely affects their ability to make good decisions. Or in some cases, and maybe in the Truckee case, their inability to make a decision at all because they just don't have that knowledge base. So it's important. It's intrinsically linked, I think.
You're probably seeing the same thing we are, and that with the dynamics in the industry, with a lot more low-time pilots coming through, and often you're seeing two first officers coming at the same time for a captain. So it's one thing to see that style when everything's going well. It's a whole nother thing to exhibit that style, the correct leadership style when an engine shut down or you've got a hydraulic failure, right. You've got all of that stuff going on. So it's pretty easy to mimic the normal operational command authority. But when things start to get out of whack, and I'm sure you're seeing the exact same thing. Yeah.
We do. One of the most important leadership skills for any pilot is to know when the workload's getting high, and how to mitigate that. Right?
Yep.
How do you do that? Right? You have to recognize that.
Simulated training is, I know over the years I didn't enjoy it all the time, but it's invaluable. The things you can do in there, you just can't do in the airplane.
It's amazing how you can sweat in that seat, in that box, right?
Absolutely.
Thinking it's the real deal.
All right, I know.
Just add one thing to that.
Yeah, sure.
For those of us that were not in the box 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, only once or twice a year, when we're flying routine and regular missions, we like playing the what if game. And so in low stress, what if, type deal. So that's a way to stay sharp, and it builds camaraderie as well. That helps with the communication that you were referencing, and the crews getting to know each other. And then all of a sudden it becomes, hey, did you know this? Did you know this? So it's constant improvement and always learning, even when you're in a low stress, and when you're at cruise for an hour or two or three, that you can have those kind of conversations as if there were an emergency or an anomaly or something like that. So that's something that we do as well.
Excellent idea.
And we all know that, straight and level flying can be pretty boring for 2-3 hours. So that's a great thing to be doing. And we do a lot of that too,
Absolutely. Okay, I know we got to keep moving on here. I've got so many questions. I know we're not going to get through them all, and I want to make sure we have time out here. Let me ask our operators, do any of you employ contract crews or have in the past?
We do.
I see some shaking. Okay, head shaking. Okay. So how about out in the audience? Anybody contract pilots or have? There's a few. I know there's a lot of people out there. I mean, I've done some contract flying in the past myself. What do our operators here, what do you require of a contract pilot before you put them in the cockpit with one of your other crew members?
We always pick people we know. So it's not a matter of, somebody would get off the internet or something like that. It's all people nearby that we've known for a long time. We know what their skill level is. We know what their personality is.
Okay.
I know and we're fortunate where we have a lot of, through the vendors that we get supplied pilots through, we have a lot of familiarity with them. So we only usually contract out SICs, I believe, and they need to do a kind of familiarization acknowledgement of our GOM, especially some kind of key areas we make sure to highlight. But we're fortunate where it's not too often we're using contract pilots we haven't used before. But when we do require some kind of basic familiarization with our SOPs, especially if they're going into somewhere specifically, like a special use mountainous airport. We require more debriefing and briefing from the PIC as well with that contract pilot prior to the flight.
After hearing about this accident, maybe reading about it and everything in the docket and everything, is there anything more you think somebody should require of a contract pilot before pairing them?
I was just stunned at the fact that there was just no vetting of the pilot. I was stunned at the management structure of the company. It was a very young company. It was only 2 years old or a year old or something. I'm not sure that the management of the company was in a position to properly vet, that they had the experience to vet, and they didn't even try, I mean, I think in some of the new companies out there, if somebody's running a company that's got very low time, they got 200 or 500 hours, and somebody comes along with 14,000 hours. My God, that's a God, and I couldn't possibly, qualify them. And so, in this particular case, I think just about everything they could have done wrong, they did.
Okay. Let me ask our training operators one more question here. So we had stall warning going off, stick busher, ground procs going off. What should these crews have done? I know you know this because you make us do it every time we go in the box. What should have been happening at that point? Well, one, they shouldn't have got there, right?
That's right.
But the stabilized approach was already not stabilized.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, clearly the answer is there should have been a single expression of go around. There shouldn't have been any discussion about it, go around. And then talk about it later on. Or simply my controls, not let me have the airplane or let me see the airplane, I think was the expression he was using. That's ambiguous. My controls and take the airplane. I mean, that's what you would expect to see in the training environment. That's what you expect to see in the real world. Agreed? Yeah.
same. Is there any other technology out there that might have prevented this? I mean, we're in the technology age, right?
Well,
I've heard some people, if they only had our this on the airplane, that would have warned them. But my concern is everything's going off and they're not heeding the warnings.
Yeah, so one of the things that seems to be a struggle for people is to understand where they are in the protected airspace. And so having some sort of a dynamic visual representation of that in the cockpit would be really powerful. So if it was displayed on the avionics where it calculated based on, it knows your speed. I mean, it knows what you've got programmed in there. So it knows what category it should be based on that procedure that you've pulled up out of the database. So having a dynamic protected airspace envelope would prevent people from getting too tight, because generally that's what you see is people end up too tight in and then they end up into an overbank situation or an overshoot. So I think if there was a technological solution that would be beneficial, that would be one.
It's good to know. Anybody else?
I would say we fly technologically advanced aircraft and proper knowledge and understanding and competency within the FMS system. So it's not only the alerts and the notifications, the CAS of, the stick pusher and the shaker and all that and ground proximity, but if you briefed your approach and you had your FMS set up right, you have your constant, descent slope on there, you know what your MDA is, you have your obstacle up there. So if you have your FMS set up properly, it would greatly enhance your situational awareness, including if you have your protected area, which I think Steve said was 3 miles for the category of aircraft. You know where your protected area is for your circle to land, so you can still keep the autopilot on. And I mean, we know all that, right? We do it in training all the time, but to your point, do we need more technology? I think make sure that there's a familiarity and understanding and competency of the FMS of what we already have there. maybe there's AI or some autopilot that'll auto-engage like EDM does or something. But honestly, I think situational awareness and being familiar with the FMS and briefing it before you get there makes all the difference in the world.
It's a good point, because in that CVR, there was a lot of talk, like there was, the first officer was instructing him on how to use the box in a couple cases, and issues with setting up the hold and things that I was able to listen to it, that just showed the different level of experience in that cockpit. So, all right, we're with inside 15 minutes, and I knew I told you that I was going to allow the audience to ask some questions. So now is that time. Raise your hand. Somebody will bring you a microphone. Please wait till you get a microphone. And if you would, please state your name and who you're with, and then your question, please. Okay, go for it.
My name's Jeff Wofford.
Hang on, it's not working. That's a good start.
Yeah, my name's Jeff Wofford. I'm currently operating a consulting company and manage an airplane. But I've been in corporate aviation for a long time. I think I finished my 68th recurrent in June. I've had the pleasure of doing CAE and flight safety. I think my question is that, other than the organizational issues as far as allowing this crew to be paired together without appropriate training or at least some kind of communication, everything else can be addressed through training. And so I guess my question is to you guys is, when we look at what we normally do in a recurrent session, it's gotten to the point now where there's so much information and so much stuff we have to do that there's very little room to add anything else to a recurrent. But I wonder, do you think it's time that we go to the FAA and say, okay, from a risk mitigation standpoint, when we look at what's causing accidents, it's not engine failures, it's not a lot of these other things we practice, but to take a look from an industry standpoint at the things that are killing people, which are loss control in flight, runway excursions, and different issues like this that we don't really address well. And due to the fact that we have a limited amount of time in a recurrent session, it makes it difficult for the training providers to put a scenario together to be able to address these issues. So, I think it's one of the things. Do you think there's a way we can approach the FAA? And also the FAA standpoint now is rather than doing training and checking, it's a check ride and then sort of training after the fact. So, we've seen this go back and forth over the years. And so, I think this is one of the things that as an industry, do you think it's possible that we can approach the FAA, maybe with the NTSB's help, and look at making some significant changes in the way we actually do training?
Richard, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Wholeheartedly agree with you. So I think both companies, we do different things, but essentially towards the same goal. We access the CFOCA data from the GE digital program there to use that for the basis of focusing on things like runway excursions, loss control, and flights just about to deploy. We just did a couple of other modules as well in between there. The FAA rules really haven't changed in about 50 years for 135, and I think there is opportunity to use the data. We're pulling data off the SIMs at both locations,
right?
And that data tells a story. We can look and see. I can tell you exactly what maneuver is causing people struggles in check rides. I can tell you exactly what maneuver is causing them struggles in training, and when it takes somebody to get proficient in it. And that data should speak volumes to the FAA and be able to say, look, I know out of these tens of thousands of activities that this maneuver just doesn't cause any problems on a check ride. Do we need to see a second non-precision approach with the autopilot on because with a procedure turn when nobody ever has a problem with that if you can do a single engine non-precision approach to a missed approach? That if you can do that, you can execute the other one pretty normally, So I do think there's opportunity, yes.
And I think it's a great question, and it's really heartening to hear that operators out there are actually concerned about the regulatory requirements for training.
Yeah.
We love that, and I can tell you that Flight Safety and CE both do a lot of discussions with the FAA about the future of aviation training, but to have the operators beating the drum out there saying, this is what we want and this is what we need, I think is really helpful.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, great. Come on, there's got to be more questions. There we go.
Hello, I'm Ben Berman from Open Air and formerly NTSB. Thanks for this great discussion. I was listening to, and I think Jeff brought this up a couple of times, but I was listening to the discussion and seeing the upticks of evidence of organizational factors in this accident. And I'm really glad the NTSB is discussing factors in the accident that really, that didn't make it into the cause, but really are relevant. I think the organizational factors are super relevant. You had obviously, to me at least, a weak captain who wasn't really qualified to be in that position because, wasn't given the training on the company's procedures and experience to do it. And then when you have a weak captain and you have a strong first officer, it's a very unbalanced thing. But it's the fact that you have a weak captain in there that's assigned by the company to command the flight that generates the imbalance. So it shouldn't be a surprise when you have an imbalance in the cockpit if it's set up by the organization. And then, the training providers acknowledge that people have trouble with circling approaches in training. They're often messed up, and we know that's true. And plus, the ones that are given in simulators aren't that representative of what it's really like to do one at Truckee in smoky conditions. So what does that say about how people are set up to succeed or fail on flights like this? We have one operator here who puts forward a great program of initial operating experience for Part 135 captains, but that's not required. And so regulatory deficiencies might be involved in this thing too. So I think there's really a big picture of this accident of organization and regulatory issues. So for the passengers who got on board that flight who were considering investing in this company and therefore fell under Part 91 and therefore inherited this crew, which wouldn't have been legal under 135 and certainly wouldn't have been in a 121 carrier because the captain would have required one or two entries and exits to Truckee with a check airman accompanying them before they were qualified. What do you all think about the organizational factors here and what we could do or should do as an industry to protect those passengers and ensure their safety?
Any thoughts from the panel?
I think we're in an unusual situation. I don't see a whole lot of real young people out there, but so many have been in the industry for a long time, and we've seen this over and over again. When times get good in aviation, a lot of people enter the industry, and they enter the industry without a whole lot of experience. And so that, to me, that's a red flag. That's something where we have to be watching as an industry about who the companies are, what their organizational structure is, what their experience is, and what their operating procedures are.
I'm not a big government fan, but I do think that there's a lot of additional safety margin that's built into the 135 that could be moved over to the Part 91 without reducing their flexibility. I understand the differences between 91 and 135, but I think some additional safety margin, just because the owner is in the back of the plane doesn't mean that they're knowledgeable on what's going on. So I think that, you can make an argument that the owners are just part of the flying public also without the knowledge, and so additional safety should be put in place. That's just a thought.
I think there's a foundation working to educate owners and people that ride in the back out there that I'm aware of. Do we have another question right here?
Hi, Mike Pape, Jackson Jet Center, we're a 135 operator. Stephen, you probably would know this. What was the level of automation on this approach, and how did that impact the accident, you believe?
So that's a great question, and I'm not sure this microphone is, it is broken. Okay. There was quite a bit of automation that was used. Hand flying really began was most of the circling approach. They were using auto throttles for a while, as you probably read in the cockpit voice recorder transcript. But the unfortunate part to the data recording is we were able to capture some of the autopilot mechanisms, but we weren't really able to, it didn't give us enough to understand, since we didn't have control input data, we couldn't really understand and compare the two to properly assess what the relation was. So there was some automation, to get back to your question, there was some automation involved, but most of it was hand flying all the way to the end.
Did we hear that the SIC was spending most of the time teaching the FMS to the captain? Was that happening?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Flight safety and CAE, you teach us that when we get stressed and get busy, the automation's supposed to reduce, correct?
Correct.
Would it have helped at all if they just start way back at the initial approach fix, hand flying? You think that would have helped out?
I don't know if the reduction of the level of automation in this accident would have had quite the impact that it does in scenarios that we subject you guys to in training. But it's a good point. I mean, it's something that has to be considered. I don't know how much the automation actually impacted this. I think more of it was decision making and.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost make the argument on this one that had they stayed on the autopilot, because when you read the transcript, you see, and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was on after they had rolled the wings level, after the initial 45-ish degree turn towards the downwind, and then the captain said the first officer said turn the autopilot off. And so they went to hand flying at that point, which dramatically increased his workload there, because now he's under stress and he's dealing with that. And I think everybody who's ever done a check ride in the simulator, you've heard the instructor say, leave that non-precision approach with the autopilot until you get to the circle, right? Why? Because it reduces your circling, it reduces your workload. And you can monitor the airplane a lot better, even though you're the pilot flying, obviously, but you're doing that monitoring as opposed to trying to do all of that and get that tunnel vision on the flight parameters.
Us to do that approach, automate all the way to that narrow leg.
Well, I would have taught you to go to 1-1 right out of the gate. So, touche, right? So, I would have said, don't even take it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, last one. Where are we at? Right there? Go for it.
Yes, Bill Grava, currently involved with a flight simulator manufacturer. Actually, here we have a AATD on display, precision flight controls, but full background, former air traffic controller, 26 years. Actually, left that when I retired, went to Challenger 300, and then got involved with an operation, Part 125, operating 6 Embraer jets. And then recently, I was up at Truckee, actually, not involved in this accident, but I was there for the inception, 2017 to 2019 for the tower. So anyways, I know the airport intimately. I know a lot of the people involved, et cetera, et cetera. Have been through CAE, initial actually 135 Embraer with flight safety. And then several times with CE for the recurrence and so on in Dallas. You know, as far as the simulator training, the quality of simulator training that we have nowadays available is excellent. However, the restrictions that are put on the training providers are the simulator's got to be certified for those airports to be signed off to circle. So
Correct.
As such, most operators don't have the latitude to go outside those to do practice events at common airports. What I instituted as the director of training for this recent organization was operation scenarios in some extra time that we built in so that you could go to the airports that we frequented and, if possible, practice other scenarios that really benefit the operation. So I think that's key, and we really need to kind of try to get the FAA once again to kind of modify the situation on what's going on in the simulation world. But we could talk for 2 hours on this event still. It was just a tragic event for all the parties involved, and it was a shame. The breakdown in communication from the ATC side, once again, low visibility. They should have gone straight into 1-1. The RNAV approach is great. It takes you right down. Slight tailwind, it probably would work still, but or they could have come over the top, left down for 2-0, or for 2-9. That's another excellent one that was used all the time. Unfortunately, that did not occur. And so that's it's tragic in all respects, and I applaud the NTSB for bringing this panel together, and I think a lot of valuable lessons were learned from that.
You bet. Thank you for that. We're about out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out here. CRM is an important tool that, if applied correctly, can result in good team collaboration, communication, and effective decision-making. We also learned how a multi-crew operation can break down when the crew's roles are not maintained, a shared mental model is not achieved, and how unilateral decision-making in a collaborative cockpit can adversely impact a flight. We've also seen how operators with 100 aircraft or fewer than 10 employ leadership and followership training, ensure quality CRM practices, and utilize contract pairing to crew their flights. I would like to thank our 5 panelists for your insight and candor and your expertise today. It was very insightful, and it was a great conversation. And I appreciate your time for doing this and sharing your knowledge with all of us today. Thank you. I want to thank our panel. I'd also like to thank our investigator in charge for the Truckee accident, Stephen Stein, for his presentation and his work on this accident investigation. Stephen, thank you. A few more people in the back that make this all happen. I'd like to thank some of our other NTSB folks, Brian Delaney, James Anderson, and Michael Hampton, for making this all happen today. Thank you, gentlemen. Finally, I want to thank the audience for your participation and hanging on for this late go. I know the parties are calling you out there. So whether you're a pilot, an operator, a training professional, or you play another role within an operation of a Part 135 or a 91 aircraft, you have a role to play in this too. Take the knowledge you gained today during this presentation and advocate for safety in your own operation. Thank you and have a great evening.